You know, with all the information that's out there regarding foods and diets and which foods are good and which foods are bad, it sure would be nice if we actually had individuals that gave us straight information and didn't try to bleed their agenda into the information that they're sharing with us. Hey guys, I'm Dr. Arland Hill and welcome back out to Harvest Hills Ranch. And today I'm actually going to put on two hats at the same time that I wear. One of which is as a professional nutritionist and working with patients and helping them improve their overall nutrition, but then also my rancher hat. I think it's important to understand some of the information that we're often presented with and actually begin to ask questions. Is this information valid or is this driven by opinion? Now, some of you are going to want to get into the details of the information that I'm going to share. And so for you, I'm just going to ask, hold on. For those of you that don't want all the details and don't want to understand the nuances behind this conversation, here's the punchline. There is an agenda for plant-based diets and to have us move away from animal-based foods. Does that mean that we should completely avoid plants altogether? No, that's not my opinion. But I do think it at least argues the point that we should have a more balanced conversation and set agendas aside. Now, with that being said, if you're looking for more of the detail, well, let's jump into this. This conversation and what piqued my interest, this has been on my mind for quite some time, but what really kind of gave me the push to put this video out and to have this conversation was a recent article that came out in The Guardian. And let me actually share that article with you here so that you can see the same thing that I'm looking at. But what was important to note about this particular article is that it had a very biased opinion. So here we go. So you'll notice on this that this shows that the most damaging farm products are organic pasture-fed beef and lamb. You know, I looked at that and I thought, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm a rancher. I raise cattle. We have a pastured poultry operation. And I just don't see how they're drawing these conclusions based on our personal experience with these animals and with the environment around us. So what I wanted to do is, first of all, as I'm jumping into this, I wanted to show you why you have to be so critical of looking at the information that's presented to you and also ask the question, well, where is this information coming from? Is this information coming from a balanced source? Now, you'll notice on this, as I scroll through here, and again, this is from The Guardian, one of the questions that I had is, who's supporting this behind the scenes? Well, interestingly enough, and not to get political, that's not the intention of this video, but you'll notice that there is notification or information here showing that Bill Gates bankrolls The Guardian, where we're getting this information about the problems with pasture-fed organic beef and lamb. And interestingly enough, we go over to another site and we see that almost $13 million has been given to The Guardian by Bill Gates. First problem with the information that we're being presented with right there. Now, with that in mind, where I want to go at this point is I want to share a couple of problems that I saw as I read through this article. There were several things that stood out to me that I thought this just doesn't make any sense. And you often find in reading articles like this that they have very hyperbolic, very exaggerated language where they try to overly emphasize the opposing points against pasture-fed animals, and that this article is no deviation away from that. It does the same thing. So let me point out a couple of things with you on this that were often, and these are not particularly unique to this article. We find that these are stated elsewhere as well, but we find things like the author saying in here that various acreage that is used for purposes of raising animal grazing lands, that these areas don't have the ability to also support wildlife. They don't have the ability to support neighboring forest areas, savannas, the natural grasslands that may have been unique to an area. And that is quite frankly a bit of a pigeonhole in the way that this is being presented, because frankly, it's not an accurate statement. If you look at let's just talk about, for example, the wild forest. When you look at any any forest and what is known as succession, where that land is going to turn back over. It starts as a grassland, then it grows into shrubs, and then over time, it's going to grow into larger trees, and eventually you have trees that are dominant in these forest areas. This does not take place in a short period of time. This is going to happen over decades, if not centuries, until you can get an area back to the point where it is actually going through this natural succession process. The animals, the grazing cattle, the grazing lambs, and I don't raise lambs, but I can tell you from grazing cattle aren't going into these areas and destroying these areas. They don't bother trees. They may eat a little bit of shrub off of a tree here or there, a little bit of browse, but that's not what they're doing. They're looking for grasses and forbs and legumes where they can find them at. That's going to be the majority of their diet. So they're not destroying these other lands when these animals are managed appropriately. Interestingly enough, I also find in this article that they go on to say that the world's most damaging farm products are organic pasture-fed beef and lamb. Again, this is one of those hyperbolic statements in that how can that be the most damaging farm product when maybe you look at the end product, if you're just speaking of the end product, but then look at all the things that go into making that end product if we're really going to have concern and talk about damaging the environment. If you look at things, for example, like pesticides and herbicides and these synthetic chemicals that are known disruptors of physiology. Granted, we don't have all the endpoints at current to show the level of detriment that they have, but logic would stand the reason that synthetic chemicals that don't have biological roles are likely to cause some type of degradation to health, whether that's the health of plants, whether that's the health of animals, or even for us as humans. But to make the argument that pastured beef and lamb are the most damaging products, when really, as an example from our ranch, we don't have any inputs into these animals. These animals get salt, sea salt to be more specific, and that's what they get. We don't put anything on our pastures. The only thing that goes on our pastures is the manure that goes behind the chickens that we raise and the ducks that we raise, as well as the manure that comes from the cattle themselves. Outside of that, there's nothing on the pasture. So to make the argument that this is the most damaging farm product is a bit disingenuous. Now, here's something else that I find funny, and obviously these articles are written by individuals who don't have a lot of time spent in a natural environment, actually just having the opportunity to sit down and watch the environment around them. So to make the argument here that where there are cattle, this is an exact line out of the article, where there are cattle, there are fewer wild mammals, birds, reptiles, and insects on the land, and fewer fish in the rivers. I actually need to take each one of these independently, and I won't belabor the points on these, but let's take fewer wild animals. In my area, the predominant wild animal is going to be white-tailed deer. And I can tell you in the time that we've been raising cattle on the ranch, we have seen an improvement in the quality of the grasses that we have, and we have a more abundance of the white-tailed deer that are coming onto the property and out foraging in the pastures. It's not uncommon for us to see them in the back pastures where they're just grazing along the woodline, but they're looking for the grasses. Sometimes we see them in the front pastures. But to make the argument that there's fewer wild mammals, I don't think that that's logical or based on the fact that cattle are driving out the wild mammals. What about birds? Well, we have a greater proportion of birds too, whether it's the cattle egrets that are more prevalent now, whether it's, for example, the cardinals in the area, or even the vultures, and just doing the natural cleanup work that they do. Reptiles, you make a quick argument with my wife about whether or not there's snakes in the area, and she's going to tell you yes. And snakes are only going to be here if they have something to be able to consume, if they have, whether it's mice out in the pasture that are in there because of the thicker grasses, they feel like that's a place to hide, and then the reptiles are in there behind them. We have frogs in the pond, and these are just not things that you're going to make an argument about that cattle are having some type of disruptive interaction on these different species, when in fact the very opposite is true. And when it comes to insects on the land, just doing an observation on a late spring, late summer morning where there's that heavy dew on the pastures, on the grasses, and being able to look across those pastures and see spider webs everywhere, that makes a strong argument that those pastures have insects all throughout them that are working in a symbiotic manner to overall support the landscape. And what about fewer fish in rivers? Well, to me, this is quite frankly silly. I don't, at least not in our property, we don't allow cattle into any areas of water. For example, once in a while, we water them in our rotations with them. We water them out of ponds. But as we're watering them out of ponds, we use electric wire, temporary electric wire, to keep them out of that. So we're not allowing them to into the water to disturb the fish, to drop their manure in there, to be out in the water deep up to their knees and up to their bellies, urinating and defecating in the water. We're not doing anything like that. So this ideology that cattle are ruining the water, that's a management issue. That's not an issue related directly to cattle. Now, what else did I find problematic in this article? Well, now the conversation starts to change a bit, because now we start getting into this ideology about the actual term regenerative. I'm not aligned with any particular term out there, but I do think it's funny because this author goes on to talk about the minimum definition for ecological regeneration is permitting trees to return to formerly wooded lands, making the suggestion that trees aren't going to grow in pastured areas. I tell you what, guys, let's take a look at one of my pastures, and this is one of our pastures, and where the cattle happen to be right now, and look at the number of trees that are growing and that are coming up that I have to cut back generally about once a year so that they don't take back over the pasture. The cattle are not destroying trees. They're not even interfering with the trees that are propagating themselves. The trees can do that very easily. In fact, when the trees are dropping their seeds, the cattle walking behind them are often going to help potentiate the process and move it along faster, because now we're getting seed to soil contact with the seeds for that tree. So this doesn't hold a lot of water either. Now, there's an argument here that cattle fencing excludes wild herbivores and stops migration. Well, this is really a head scratcher. And clearly this individual has never seen any, whether it's a white-tailed deer or any other type of deer or any animal in that category. They have never witnessed these animals, because I can tell you, in a 5-strand barbed wire fence, a white-tailed deer can walk straight up to that barbed wire fence flat-footed and clear that fence with no problem. That'll hold back cattle all day long. And in the event, say it's a smaller one, we've seen this with fawns and smaller does where they don't jump the fence, they just run through it. They don't need to jump the fence. So this idea that cattle fencing excludes wild herbivores and you're going to hold back animals out in the western part of the United States like elk and antelope and mule deer, things of this nature, is even more ludicrous. Those animals are even more agile. So this whole idea that you're disrupting these natural migratory patterns, not so much, guys. The deer are a little more agile than that. Let's give them a bit more credit for the God-given abilities that they were designed with. Now, we couldn't have a conversation about this if we didn't get into talking about the infamous greenhouse gases. This is what always, with this plant-based argument, always circles back to. And again, remember, the reason I'm making points about sharing this with you is because you're being indoctrinated. And I'm going to emphatically use that term, indoctrinated, with this ideology that plant-based foods are inherently better and you're doing some noble activity of saving the environment. You're not. Wake up, you're being lied to. All right. So this author, and here's what kind of tricks they like to pull. This author talks about carbon opportunity cost, and he breaks this down into climate current account and climate capital account. So what they like to do is use these terms that sound real slick and fancy to make you think that the more the more detailed that they can make this, the more the problem is, the bigger the problem is. We can actually, the problem is so big that we have to break it into sectors and make it more nuanced. And the more nuanced we make it, oh, by the way, you don't understand it. We're just going to keep telling you it's a big problem. That's the game, guys. That's the lie. Here's the reality on this. And let's actually go and use some of the data that is coming directly from the EPA. So let me share some information with you here. And I want to show you out of an article. It's not actually an article. This is a paper that was published by the EPA. And in fact, as I show you this here, I'll give you the exact resource for this. This came out of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency inventory of U.S. greenhouse gases, emissions, and sinks for the last 30 years. And what you're going to notice on this is that if you look at where these emissions are coming from, you can see that agriculture takes up the smallest portion of this graph, the smallest portion, guys. And of that, that is not differentiating between cattle production. It's not differentiating between row crop production. And I can tell you of that 11%, about 2.7 to 3%, somewhere in that ballpark of that 11% actually comes from cattle. And we're worried about the emissions coming from cattle now, and from lamb, as is pointed out by this article. But let me tell you how disingenuous this conversation is, because these are all of these animals that they're pointing to are falling under the category of what are known as ruminant animals. And within that same category, all of the species that I mentioned earlier, the elk, the white-tailed deer, the mule deer, antelope, all of these animals that are ruminant animals, bison, which they're great herds in the United States. Granted, nowhere near to the level that they were previously, but they're significant. Why do we never hear about the production from these animals? Because it doesn't fit the agenda. We don't need to talk about the bison and the deer, because they're not going to do anything about those. That's not going to talking detrimentally about those is not going to drive their plant-based agenda. So it doesn't behoove them to do so. So this 11% that you see, the first thing you need to recognize about that is that just the fact of running your home, getting in your car and driving to work or going wherever you need to every day, and the industry that runs our society. I'm not villainizing any of these things, but I'm asking you to take a more realistic look at where those greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, and how important is it really to decrease those in relation to cattle or any other animal-based food that we're talking about today. It's not really all that important. Now, here's the other thing is I really got a shock out of this. Let me actually just scroll up here a little bit. And this is out of the same report. And this is looking at the use of land over the last 30 years. And as you read through this article, one of the things that you see is that there is an insinuation that so much land is being taken up by grazing animals that it's basically inching into other uses of land, and it's causing a problem. It's destroying the farmland. It's destroying the forest land. It's cutting into the wetlands, and we've got to stop this increasing grazing. Well, look at this, guys. Over the last 30 years, starting from 1990 all the way to 2020, there's basically no difference in any of these categories in terms of use for forest land, for cropland, for grassland, for wetlands. They're all essentially the same. In fact, the amount of cropland decreased, but you see the grassland, the forest land, the wetlands actually increase, but these numbers are all relatively the same. So to make an argument around that is just flat out silly. It doesn't make any sense to suggest that all these grazing animals are causing such a massive problem out there in terms of taking over more land, and we can't effectively use that land more efficiently. So when you look at this information that you're often presented with around this plant-based argument and suggesting that we need to discontinue animal-based food consumption because it's such a detriment to the environment, it's going to be so detrimental to our future and to the future of our children, guys, That is all inflammatory language that is meant to invoke an emotional response with you, and it is not based in concrete evidence. It's a one-sided position that is unbalanced. And that's all I'm asking you to do when you look at this information is just think about it. Go do some research for yourself and see, does this make sense to you in terms of the information that you're being presented with? And don't do what they expect you to do, which is just take the information from some authoritative source like The Guardian, who must be putting information out in the people's best interest, but when in reality, they're putting information out in the information like this in the best interest of Bill Gates and others like him that have a vested interest in the plant-based agenda. That's the reality of what's going on out there. So do your due diligence, do your homework. Guys, if you're looking for more information about how to make the best dietary choices that are unique to you, that don't follow an agenda, whether that's more protein in your diet, whether you need to improve your plant-based composition in your diet and create some diversity there, whatever that looks like, drarlandhill.com. Go to my website and you can find more information about how to start that journey for yourself. And if you're looking for whether it's pasture-raised beef, pastured poultry, duck and chicken eggs that are free range, turkey, guys, Harvest Hills Ranch is going to be your resource for uncompromising food. This is the same food that I produce for me and my family, and it's the same quality of food that I would only share with you as the consumer. So you can check out Harvest Hills Ranch for that information as well. Until next time, guys, Dr. Arland Hill. We'll see you soon.